Well, it's very nice to be here again in a collaboration between the London School of Economics and the Fundación Raras. It's been over a decade of collaboration between our two institutions. I'm delighted to have with me today Alistair Maguire, who's Head of Health Policy at the London School of Economics. He's also been a visiting professor at Harvard and Sydney and Pompeu Fabra in Spain. He teaches and researches health economics, public and private healthcare provision, and has advised and consulted widely with governments and pharmaceutical companies around the world. Today we're going to talk about rare diseases, and so we're also joined with Panos Kanavos, who's Associate Professor of International Health Policy. He was also a fellow at Harvard and has taught at Basel, Delaware, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, a great institution in London. He's also an economist, and he's worked with the EU Commission, the World Bank, the OECD, the Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Health in 28 transition countries, which is a particularly fascinating part of his work. Today we're going to talk about rare diseases. So I'd like to ask Panos straight away, give us a broad sort of definition of what rare diseases represent, or what kind of broad terms are we talking about in this particular context?
Thanks, Adam, and many thanks for the kind invitation. Rare diseases are, broadly speaking, diseases afflicting small numbers in a country's population. There's quite a few thousand of those conditions classified as rare. It's about 5,000 to 5,500 or thereabout. Interestingly, different countries have got different definitions of what constitutes a rare disease. For example, in the United States, the population threshold for a disease to be classified as rare is about 200,000. So the disease has to kind of afflict, so to speak, about 200,000 US population to be characterized or to be classified as a rare disease. In the European Union, that threshold was about 250,000. Obviously, larger population in Europe, slightly smaller population in aggregate terms in the United States. More frequently, however, we're talking about classification of a disease as rare or orphan based on prevalence. So the prevalence threshold is calculated usually on a based on the prevalence at 10,000 per 10,000 population. So the threshold in Europe, in the European Union, is 5 per 10,000 population. In the US, it comes to about 5.6 people per 10,000 population. In Australia, is about, if I remember correctly, 1 or 1.5 people per 10,000 population. In Japan, 4 per 10,000 population. So this gives us a sort of an idea of the differences by country. And I think these differences are there for a reason. But obviously, different countries have got different regulations or different perceptions of characterization of a disease as rare. So the thing to remember, therefore, is either a population threshold or, more frequently, a threshold based on prevalence. So low prevalence of disease within a country's population. Another interesting statistic, if you allow me, is that about 40% of all rare diseases are cancer, have got cancer indications. So about 40% of all conditions that we know are related to oncology. The other 60%, obviously, different indications in different therapeutic areas, and so on and so forth. By and large, about 5,000 to 5,500 conditions classified as rare. I hope that helps as a start.
It does indeed. Thank you very much, Ali. Any additional comments to that opening?
Yes, well, first of all, thanks very much to the Foundation for the invite to this talk, and welcome to the audience. As Panos said, rare disease is associated with the actual prevalence in the population. It has to be low numbers. I think also, as he said, about 40% of rare diseases are based on oncology diagnosis, although somewhere around 80% are associated with underlying genetic predispositions. So there's about 80% with this genetic predisposition, which then, of course, gets us into a discussion of personalized medicine, and I'm sure we'll get into that later in this discussion. The other thing to say, though, is that the rare disease treatments and drugs have been growing immensely over the last 5-10 years, and also growing in volume in terms of the sales, but also in terms of their expenditure. And for example, there are now about 650 indications which are associated with orphan drugs, and that's risen about 50 odd percent over the past 5 years. So there's been a huge growth in these medicines over the 5 years within the US, and I'm sticking to the US here as the primary market in which these orphan drugs are introduced, and then they diffuse into other areas, other countries from the US being the largest pharmaceutical market, accounting for about half of the expenditure in pharmaceuticals globally. And in terms of the prices and expenditure on these drugs, these drugs are now accounting for billions of dollars of spend within the US, and they are roughly about 30% of medicine spend in the US is now on orphan drug indications. That goes down slightly when you start thinking about a mix of orphan drugs and traditional medicines within any given indication to about 15%. So about 30% expenditure on the orphan drugs themselves, but then tempered by the overall treatment costs going down to about 10% for these indications. So they're as Panos said, just to reiterate, they're really associated with the prevalence of the disease within any given population, and that prevalence has to be low. However, the expenditure levels are growing and are quite considerable now.
Thank you. I think I'll just pick up straight from that introduction, and many thanks to both of you for that very clear and definition in many ways. But it sounds to me from some of the work that we were together doing in Latin America not so long ago, things were rather different. So there sounds like there's been quite a shift or an advancement in the last decade, let's say, in the approach to resolving some of these rare diseases through the drug or the health technology treatment. So I'm interested very much in thinking about, or trying to understand for the audience as well, what have been the overall policy designs perhaps and implementation in the US as a main focus, but maybe in Europe as well, to try and ensure what used to be a very complex, or perhaps still is a very complex approach to investing large sums in research and development for drugs that only have a smaller kind of use, let's say, or population application to a smaller group of people, rather than the blockbuster drugs that many pharmaceuticals try and produce, obviously. So have there been breakthroughs in the policy environment? Have there been incentives? How has that shift been clearly to some strong degree of successful? How has that happened in the last perhaps decade or this reasonable time frame?
I think, shall I go first? Is that right?
Yes,
yeah.
Please.
Okay. Well, I think it goes beyond the last decade. What you've seen in the last decade is really an explosion in technologies that utilize that take us from platform level into multiple drug targets and multiple indications. But I'll come back to that later on. I think if we had to look at policies that have actually been established over the past 30 years or so, because that's the time frame, We're starting with the enactment of the Orphan Drug Act in the United States in 1993, which practically recognized the importance of rare diseases and the importance of providing incentives, if you will, to manufacturers to do conduct research and development in areas where up to that point were under-researched. And of course, the rationale remained then and remains now that the commercial interest of trying to produce drugs for small populations would not necessarily be there. So the enactment of the Orphan Drug Act kind of filled a particular gap. Europe, actually Australia was the first, if I remember correctly, in 1990, followed by the US in 93, and Europe followed with the orphan drug regulation in the year 2000, and Japan again in 1993. So the 90s and the early 2000s were benchmark years for that on that front. It's important to remember what these, let's say, legislative acts did. First of all, they provided a market exclusivity for those manufacturers that bring orphan drugs to market. So the market exclusivity in the US is 7 years. In Europe is 10 plus 2 for pediatric indications, the additional 2 years for pediatric indications. And in Japan, if I remember correctly, is also 10 years. What that means is that the regulator, the government, so to speak, is providing manufacturers with an institutional monopoly. In other words, you have a single producer, a single manufacturer for selling a drug and leveraging a particular market designated as orphan for a period of time. And that period of time obviously differs by country. So that's a very, very strong incentive. So it's a virtual monopoly. That over time, and going back to Ali's introductory remarks earlier on, has led to, if you will, I would use the term explosion of orphan medicinal products or orphan drugs on the market, not only in the US, but also in Europe, in Australia, and in Japan. So an interesting statistic to remember that quantifies what Ali said earlier on is, for example, that the ratio of total drug approvals by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States with drugs designated as orphans is about 15%. In other words, 15% over the period from 1993 to about 2020. In other words, about 15% of all drugs that have been approved during that time by the drug regulator is designated as orphan. In Europe, that percentage is about 10% or thereabout. So it's quite an interesting statistic. That's 1 in 10 or 1 in 7 drugs that have been approved over a 30-year period are basically have basically an orphan designation. So I'll pause here because there are obviously other incentives that these legislative acts are providing, and that includes obviously regulatory assistance, credits, and so on and so forth. Which I'll give Ali an opportunity to say a few things, and I'll come back to some of the more specifics.
So Panos has talked largely about the back end, if you like, of the development process in terms of gaining market authorization, etc. I suppose there are kind of 3 distinct phases, if you like, in any drug's development. There's the research phase, which is the primary phase of the mechanism through which the drug is going to work. And I think that's quite important because the way in which these new drugs in oncology in particular, but other areas for rare diseases and mapping into the genomic delivery, if you like, of these drugs, the way in which the research has developed has moved us away from the second element, which is the clinical trial element, to provide information on the cause of mechanism and I'll say a bit more about that. And then the back end that Panos has been talking about is the patent to market authorization stage. So we have these 3 stages: research, trial information, and data to support any inkling that these drugs are going to be effective in a human population. And then the 3rd phase being the patent regulatory market authorization phase. And I think these new drugs which are targeting rare diseases have affected all 3 phases of this development. The first phase in research, as I said, because these drugs are about 80% are associated with genetic predispositions, the research has changed quite dramatically. And obviously it's linked to the rollout of the Human Genome Project, so that now we're mapping out the human genome and we're beginning to be able to get technologies like SNP technology, which allows us to take certain parts of the human genome and really interrogate that in full detail, and trying to look at these new genomic technologies to see where diseases might occur and might affect the genetic setup of any individual. And now about 1 in 4 patients who were previously undiagnosed can now get a diagnosis through these new technologies. So that's helped increase the volume of rare disease categorization, if you like. And the research element, therefore, has changed dramatically over the past 10 years to allow much more specificity into which individuals may, and I emphasize the may here, may actually be respondent to new drugs in these rare conditions. Because not everybody's going to respond, because the genetic setup obviously is predicated partly on individual response rates. And I'll come back to that maybe. That new technology allows us to change the trial evidence that's required, because the trial evidence, it used to be traditionally somebody would come up with a molecule, say, well, this molecule has this mechanism which may affect the disease and change the trajectory of the disease. Now it's much more about, well, the trial information that's required is really about associations between what might happen in any individual within a population, within a rare disease population, but we don't exactly know what's going to happen, because we know that the respondent rate of the individual will affect the efficacy of the drug. And so the trial data that's required now has been, if you like, fast-tracked a bit in terms of the regulatory process, so that instead of saying there's a mechanism here, there's a plausible association here, and really we have to go into phase 1 or phase 2. Phase 1 and phase 2 are really about, does the mechanism exist? Is it safe? Prior to phase 3, running out a full clinical trial in a population. So they've been fast-tracked to get information based on the mechanisms through which these things work in the second phase. And then after that fast tracking, because the information is a bit more, let's say, open to interpretation than under regular traditional clinical trials, the regulation, which Panos has alluded to at the back end, the patents and the market authorization, then kicks in, and the health technology assessment agencies, the agencies who actually regulate getting a drug to market, have taken the fast track information, the early data information, with all the uncertainty surrounding it, and then said, well, actually, we need to change how we regulate some of these new medicines, because we know there is a risk that they're only going to affect a very small population in a very minor way, and therefore we want you to put the drug on market, but then we'll come back to you after such a length of time, a year, 2 years, and see whether the drug's actually hitting the responders in a particular way. So it's a huge sea change in both how research is done, how the trials are conducted, and how the regulatory structure is imposed on these drugs.
So that's extremely interesting, I think, so it's an approach that, by the development of the health technology being of a higher importance perhaps, or a higher policy focus, that would then mean you adapt the regulations around the outcomes that you have with the understanding of the risks that involves. So the speed to market is, a balanced approach, but perhaps a more driven by outcomes of the success of the technology rather than sticking rigidly to the regulation. Is that about right, Panos? Or
yeah, no, it's absolutely right. I think there's a series of incentives all over. So the regulatory acts that I mentioned earlier on primarily look at the IP issues. So what is important, when I mentioned the market exclusivity, this is unique to orphan drugs, and it comes in addition to any intellectual property that a new molecule may have. So the statutory patent period of 20 years, and also other forms of IP, for example, data exclusivity. In other words, the originator manufacturer has the right to protection of the data they generate as part of the clinical development process. So the market exclusivity is a unique, let's say, incentive for orphan medicinal products, so that they can come to market as an absolute monopoly, basically, in the therapeutic area where there is an orphan designation for several years. So in other words, we have a sort of a triple effect: patent, data exclusivity, and market exclusivity. And I think that's important to bear in mind. So I started off with that aspect. I think Ali was very eloquently describing the changes in the research process. And I think it's also important to look at how the regulators, in other words, the bodies that regulate marketing authorization of medicines, look at or perceive this clinical research. And I think it goes without saying that whether you're looking at the United States or Europe or Japan or Australia, and very carefully I'm excluding Canada, because Canada is a unique environment that doesn't have this orphan drug regulation in place, perceive and allow orphan drugs to come to market. Almost uniquely, orphan drugs are subject to, we call it in Europe, authorization under exceptional circumstances, for example, or accelerated approval pathways, whereby the clinical research, predominantly nowadays at phase 2, if they demonstrate promise, these drugs can come to market, knowing that it is possible in small populations. And obviously, we have drugs in therapeutic areas where the prevalence is even lower than what we mentioned earlier, to study them in a, let's say, in a phase 3 clinical trial, and so on and so forth. So we do have those paradigms of accelerated approval and so on. The other thing which is interesting is, from a regulatory standpoint, is that regulators either offer protocol assistance, in other words, to rare disease manufacturers or suppliers, so to speak, and offer fee reductions. In other words, there is an 100% reduction in the fees offered by the US FDA, or in fact, there are significant fee reductions in Europe, in Australia, and in Japan, so that the process of marketing authorization is not subject to the levies that regulators put forth. That's an additional incentive. Plus, of course, regulatory assistance in terms of protocol, research protocol, etc. In other words, how to design the clinical trials, what kind of evidence it is needed. And what is interesting also is that regulators, but also health technology assessment agencies, when we come to the next phase, when the drug is out on the market and in principle, allow lower statistical significance thresholds. So we we tend to use the 1 or the 5% statistical significance when we look at the effect, the efficacy. But I think in the case of orphan drugs, because of the small samples and so on, we allow higher, so the 10% significance level, etc. So all of these are sort of build a picture of significant incentives to SMEs, small and medium enterprises, for example, or big pharma that research and develop orphan medicinal products. And of course, there's the third bucket, which I guess gradually we're going to go into, the bucket of assessment of benefits for inclusion of these drugs into positive lists or benefits catalog. So there we're talking about positive list committees if you don't have a health technology assessment agency, or health technology assessment agencies pretty much like CADOTH exists in Canada, or NICE in England, or TLV in Sweden, or PBAC in Australia.
Yes, thank you. One of the and we will certainly come to those institutions. I think have played a significant and important role in this process. But one of the final questions, or part of the jigsaw, is I guess the pricing, the market pricing of the drugs themselves, which of course is a complicated and challenging issue where, as you say, the incentives on the policy side, the research and development side, the exclusivity, the intellectual property, the length of that patent, and so on. And there have been, very famous or infamous market manipulations that have happened in this field, but rare. But they've hit the headlines. But some of the research looks at how to pass that cost on, or how can you either subsidize or incentivize again for a small sample population. For the kinds of drugs that are being applied, and what mechanisms, is there another mechanism or part of that entire cycle, let's say from R&D to market, given it's a small market, relatively small market, that have been designed to help pharmaceutical companies make these, as well as the exclusivity, make it something that has to be profitable and viable for the shareholders in the company.
Yeah, you've raised a number of issues there, but I mean, I think, as you say, it's a very small volume market for any of these individual indications. It may be that a firm develops a product which has multiple indications, but for any single indication, the volume is small, and therefore to get return on massive R&D costs, anything up and beyond 1.3 billion to take a new molecule from R&D through to market, to recover those research costs, not surprisingly, the price has to be high if the volume's low, or at least that's the pharmaceutical industry's argument. Yes. Again, you've kind of raised the issue of, well, there may be some risk here because not everybody's going to benefit, and certainly for a number of these orphan drugs in the genetic, and 80%, as I say, are targeting genetic causes in a way. Not everybody is going to be cured. And indeed, for a lot of these orphan drugs, the average gains might be small, but for some individuals, some specific individuals, they're much larger. So it's actually, again, trying to get the responder rate up within the rare disease population that's important. So the volume's small and the response rate is even smaller. So the sort of risk of the payer, and remember, healthcare is really about insurance. We're really talking about social insurance mainly, although it could be private insurance, but that doesn't work particularly well. But social insurance, mainly funded through the employer or through tax. In Europe, it's through tax mainly. That payer then has to say, well, am I really going to carry the risk that we've got a very small volume of patients here, but very high prices, and a subgroup, and it's always only a subgroup, are going to be responders to this new treatment. So the risk sharing, the financial risk sharing, which is what you're really getting at, I think, Adam. That financial risk sharing is quite important. Now, before, in the traditional sort of setting, we had, as Panos said, patent protection. So we protected medicines for up to 20 years, or maybe slightly longer than that, so that these traditional molecules would be researched, developed, and then would have some market exclusivity associated with the patent or other regulations. And that would give them a monopoly so that they'd get all of the return for one molecule going to one or a small number of firms through that patent protection. And that would give an incentive for more R&D. But of course, when you're uncertain about the evidence and you've got a very small number of respondents being charged a very high price across the whole rare disease population, then the financial backers, the insurers, are of course trying to work out ways in which to pass the financial risk back onto the companies. And the way in which they're doing that increasingly is through some sort of risk share agreement, so that they say, okay, we're going to give you some patent protection, but actually the effective patent protection has been falling over time. The absolute number of years is 20 years, but it's down to around 12 years effectively by the time all the regulation and the data requirements kick in. So they get maybe 12 years of patent protection. And then for these rare disease areas, at least. And then the regulators are also saying, well, actually, if you're going to charge really high prices in this, albeit small volume of individuals, it might have a huge budgetary impact. And these huge budgetary impacts have to somehow be shared across the payer and the manufacturer, the provider. And so you have to prove to us that when you move from a clinical trial into the real population, that actually there is some effect here. So again, just as a coda, clinical trials are generally undertaken within a healthier population, if you like, than the treatment population. Because to get effect, you want to get rid of all the comorbidities, you want to get rid of, and that really means normally you're dealing with a younger population. In a rare disease group, that may not be so important, but you do still want to get rid of the comorbidities. And when you use the drug in the real world, you've got a much more heterogeneous population. So then the risk is that the actual responder benefit for rare disease treatments is even lower in the real population. And so again, the insurer, the funder, is saying, well, actually, you have to prove to me in my funded population that this is actually effective and it's worth the price. So we're getting some value for money. And so risk sharing agreements have started to kick in these areas as well. And I think increasingly, as these rare drugs are associated with oncology treatments, as Panos said, about 40% of them are, probably it'll be more in the future. They're beginning to think about, well, how can we risk share across here? And the obvious thing is to say, well, if you don't hit a certain level of efficacy in the real world population, after so many years, 2 years of putting it onto the market, let's say, we're not going to pay you, right? So that shifts all of the risk back onto the manufacturer, and then the manufacturer, of course, says, well, that's going to affect our R&D pipeline. So there is a feedback loop in terms of the regulation and its impact on research.
Thank you. Yes, Panos, I'm sure you'd like to comment as well on the.
Yeah, just to complement and give the let's say give some numbers based on some work that we've done at this end. I think Ali is absolutely right in highlighting the let's say the budgetary criterion, but also the efficacy versus effectiveness. And obviously, drugs are different when they're studied in a clinical trial setting compared with what is happening in real life. Now, if we are to put a few things in context, out of any 100 drugs, orphan or non-orphan, we know that about 11 or 12, about 12% therefore, are going to be rejected. In other words, over a long period of time. So about 12 out of 100 will be rejected by positive list committees or reimbursement committees or health technology assessment agents. In other words, the benefit or the additional benefit is not commensurate, is not related to the cost, right? Or it's insufficient, full stop. About of the remainder, about 60% are subject to, and now talking about orphan drugs, about 60% to 64% are subject to risk-sharing agreements. So in other words, reimbursement committees or health technology assessment bodies find that it is important to conclude these kind of arrangements with manufacturers, either because there are significant gaps in our knowledge about the rare disease and the efficacy a new orphan drug provides, or because the proportional benefit is lower than the proportional increase in the cost, etc., etc. And of these 60% to 64%, about 20 relates to what is known outcomes-based risk share. In other words, you put it out on the market, you study it in real-life conditions, and you probably either make a pricing decision ex ante. In other words, the price is going to be X, and we study the drug in real life, and assuming that it delivers the same or similar benefit in real life as it does in the clinical trial, then we'll continue reimbursing it. So that is called coverage with evidence development. The rest of the risk-sharing agreements are really financial risk-sharing agreements. In other words, discounting schemes, some kind of price volume agreements, and a whole bunch of other schemes which are important in different settings. But again, these relate to financial arrangements. A small fraction of the orphan drugs are either not subject to risk-sharing agreements or spend a significant amount of time in HTA decision-making processes. So sometimes over a year, sometimes over 2 years.
Well, thank you very much. It's clearly a complex puzzle, but with some significant progress, as you've outlined, I think, over the last 30 years, certainly, and more recently with the relative explosion of that. But a firm or clear policy and financial incentives seem to be the key for driving the relative success, let's say, in terms of the production and alleviation of extremely testing circumstances for the end user, let's call them, or the patient.
Adam,
yes,
one interesting thing here is, and I think we've both Ali and I have alluded to that earlier on, is the multiple indications, particularly in cancer orphan drugs. So you have multiple indications, and many of these indications are not necessarily orphan. So if you have a drug, for example, that comes in with multiple indications, it is more likely than not that they will first of all launch a rare indication, an orphan indication. So in terms of sequencing, partly because the pecuniary benefit is there, either in terms of higher willingness to pay by insurance systems, or because of the flexibility that some countries have in terms of allowing flexibility in terms of pricing arrangements. So the list price is going to be much higher. And then the hope is that when the first indication is orphan, then a similar price will be offered in subsequent, or be awarded, if you will, for subsequent indications. Most countries, if you're looking outside the European Union, Japan, Australia, Canada, US, do not necessarily have the tools to leverage and therefore distinguish between different indications and orphan versus non-orphan indications. So what prevails in the case of orphan is the case for subsequent indications, which I think many countries do not, are not able to distinguish between the former and the latter, and that is a problem. So multiple indications and the sequencing of multiple indications, particularly with the first and or the second being rare, orphan, is a key incentive, if you will. It's not a direct incentive, but it's an indirect incentive and a finding, if you will, on the supply side. In other words, manufacturers seeking to obtain coverage in different countries.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Panos and Ali. I just changing the subject slightly, and I don't want to mix up two themes specifically, but I wanted to touch on the concept of quality of life years as well, and try and get an understanding of how this particular field, orphan drugs, rare diseases, and the calculation or the various formula and the assessment, let's say, of quality of life years are related, and perhaps not to complicate things even more, but perhaps in the policy context or the institutional context of the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, for example, in the UK, or the FDA in the US, and other institutional organizations that have undertaken the research and advised government on policy making as well. So in that broader context, perhaps addressing each of those areas one by one, or perhaps an overview of how certainly the quality of life years and the orphan drug issues are perhaps related, and what's the role of these institutions that have helped the progress, the journey of this particular field. Ali, would you like to take that one first?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say about that is that quality of life, the quality adjusted life years gained, are merely a way of defining the way in which some health benefit which is associated with a drug can be quantified. And I think that's quite interesting, because obviously you'd hope that any new therapy would maybe prolong life, so you get a change in the numbers of life years that you might live, and they might also alleviate some morbidity so that your quality of life can increase. And there are different, normally we kind of know whether somebody's alive or dead, so we know how to count the number of years, that extension, and but getting an idea of their change in their morbidity, quality of life, is more difficult. But there are instruments which allow us to do that, and therefore we can quantify in some way the change in quality of life and length of life. Now, for a lot of these drugs, these for rare indications, we're dealing with people who are kind of going to have shortened lives. Okay, so for a lot of the drugs, we may have some information on their length of life. It's not always the case, but we may have some indication as to how long they're going to live if they're treated. But that's not always a given, right? We have to follow people up, and information is getting better on that. We don't always have information on the morbidity and the side effects of these drugs and the quality of life, therefore. So again, we have to kind of amass information and data once a drug's in place to give us information and data on quality of life. And then that's one thing. So we can do it in practice. Right? However, there's a lot of really strange things that happen when you start asking about quality of life in particular, and asking about what's happening with quality of life at an individual level. And some jurisdictions obviously don't like doing that. They don't like the idea that you're going to really quantify how big or small any treatment effect is going to be at an individual level. So for historical reasons, which I think are fairly explicit and fairly easy to work through, Germany, for example, doesn't like looking at changes in quality of life at the individual level. So they tend to look at more length of life, but also if there's no information on length of life, they'll look at more intermediate outcomes like degrees of disease progression. Okay, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Or for the states, the United States, for example, which, as I said, is about half of the pharmaceutical market, and more than that for these rare drug indications. In the US, the Affordable Health Care Act, which was the Obama Act, which increased the insurance coverage of the population in the United States, it explicitly bans talking about quality and length of life in terms of quality, as in quality adjusted length of life. So it bans any evidence being collected on quality of life for their public insured populations, Medicare for the over 65s, Medicaid for those in poverty, and that's about 40% of the insurance coverage in the United States. So they ban any idea that you could look at quality adjusted life years gained. And the rationale there was really a political one, to say we're not going to have death spiral committees. We're not going to have committees which look at, you know, how much we can say somebody's going to die sooner than somebody else. So we're going to ban that. And that's the current state of affairs. Whereas in some other countries in Europe, including the UK, most of the Scandinavian countries, the public sector in France, Italy, Spain, in the regions in Spain, it differs a bit across regions in Spain, but there's much more explicit acknowledgement that we have to quantify health benefit. And the one way to do that is quality adjusted life years gained. Now, that's a general background. So some regulatory authorities say, okay, we're going to look at these new drugs in a rare disease, which come out with evidence on how the disease progresses, and we might take that as the evidence of effect, but we're also going to try to map that into quality adjusted life years gained, and we're going to get the benefit in that sense. Or there might be another, for the United States or for Germany, for example, they might focus on the clinical trial outcomes, disease progression, or the number of tumors, the size of the tumor shrinkage, for example, if it's oncology. So there's a difference across the regulatory regimes as to who uses quality of life and who doesn't. But then there's another twist when you look at these rare diseases. And that twist, as Pana said, about 40% of these rare drug indications are in oncology, and about 80% are genetically associated diseases, right? Now, if you've got a genetic associated disease, you then know through screening, and we can talk about maybe who bears the screening costs later, but we know through screening who's at most risk of these diseases, right? So we screen somebody and say, oh, you're a BRCA1 carrier, so you're at risk of breast cancer, for example, or ovarian cancer. So we do the screening, we know who's got the gene mutation, and we then know which individuals are actually going to be affected or are possibly going to respond to any rare disease treatment. And of course, once you get down to the individual level and you say, well, your quality and length of life is going to be affected for you specifically at this rate, then it becomes quite an interesting and fairly difficult public policy, because are we then going to say that for certain individuals who have genetic predispositions, we have to then have some insurance coverage for them? And if you think about the private insurance market might not want to take these individuals on, so they pass them on to the public sector. And then should we say in the public sector, you know, you can't exclude these individuals and you have to take them on? And so, for example, you know, Huntington's disease is a genetic it's a difference, it's a mutation found at a specific point on a chromosome. It's easily identifiable, and we know what the life expectancy. It's not very good for somebody with Huntington's disease. So, for example, taking not the healthcare insurance, but taking life insurance. If somebody with Huntington's disease seeks out life insurance, should they get it or not? Right. So we're down to an individual level now. And Switzerland voted on this, for example, about 10 years ago. And they have referendum, and they're much better at referendum than, say, the UK, for example. We all know how bad we are at mapping out referenda, but they do a lot of their public policy in Switzerland is carried out through referenda. And there was a very narrow vote. It was something like 55 to 45% across Switzerland to say that people with the genetic predisposition towards getting Huntington's disease should not be excluded from the purchase of life insurance. So private life insurance companies have to give them the coverage. And so if you think about that mapping back to the rare disease area in healthcare, it raises a whole host of issues about is quality of life really an important element, or is it just one important element in the disease? Do we have to look at responder rates? Do we have to look at, for example, because a lot of these rare diseases are going into end of life, do we have to modify our instruments to measure quality of life? Do we have to think about how we deal with the side effects of any treatments and for end of life treatments for oncology in these specific predisposed individuals? And so I think there is quite an open debate arising now about whether quality of life actually encompasses enough information on health benefit here or not. And that's mixed, as I say, with this notion that the average effects may be very small for some of these rare disease drugs, because you have a population who have the disease, and then you have a treatment which comes along which affects their genetic predisposition, and some of them will respond, but others don't. And the ones who respond might respond magnificently and, you know, be cured. The tumor size might shrink completely. But for others, the disease progression is such that we could map it, but it might actually improve, but then suddenly drop and the person unfortunately dies. So at the rare disease level, once we get down to individuals, it becomes increasingly difficult to think about an overall capture of health benefit there, not least because we can more or less identify the group at risk. And then once the treatment starts, we can more or less identify the responders. And even just to conclude on this, even that's interesting, because I use the information on the BRCA1 carriers, and these are women who are at high risk of ovarian cancer or breast cancer. And we know that in the UK, there's been a large study which has said that even if you identify and tell the woman that they're at risk of breast or ovarian cancer, these women do not necessarily go on to take up treatment. About 50% do, and about 50% delay treatment, even although they know they're at high risk. So you're getting into difficulties of how to convey the information, who's the respondent, what the health benefit is, and how to define that. So it's complex, but it's a very interesting public policy question.
It is, Panos. So let me come into this point.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting stuff, and I think I would definitely agree with Ali. I had two additional remarks there, well, complementary remarks. The first is that, in part because of this complexity, some countries have adopted a budgetary, or if you will, an affordability criterion, instead of going into the pains of assessing quality of life, comparative assessment of clinical benefit, cost effectiveness, and so on. and said, well, okay, we will consider the benefit of this new orphan drug as given based on the clinical information that has come to us from the regulator, and we will not assess it, assuming that the cost to our system at the price that the manufacturer is charging, or some permutation thereof, through external reference pricing or through other methodologies, is not greater than, I don't know, 30 million, 40 million euros. I think these are roughly the thresholds that some countries have set out in their legislation, and I'm referring to France and Germany and so on. If it is higher than that, then unavoidably we're going to have to somehow look into factors such as effectiveness, efficacy versus effectiveness, efficiency, so that takes us into cost effectiveness, and ultimately balance these two against affordability and budget impact. So these are some of the items that are going on here. The other remark really is that there are, particularly in the context of rare diseases, there are important modifiers, and that speaks basically to what Ali mentioned earlier on about the complexity, what is quality of life, and so on. So rarity, as such, is recognized in many countries' public policy as a modifier. In other words, reimbursement committees and HTA bodies are having a much sort of more relaxed approach to approving, for the purposes of coverage by health insurance, these drugs. And beyond rarity, it is also severity and unmet clinical needs. So these are more general modifiers, but ones that very frequently play into decision makers' thinking about coverage. So if you look at the drugs that have received approval by HTA bodies, orphan drugs, we know that over 70%, in over 70% of these, the criterion of severity has been met. In other words, reimbursement committees and HTA bodies have recognized that they address a severe condition. So that in itself acts as a modifier. And in over 65%, we have the criterion of unmet medical need. And going back to how we're doing adjustments very frequently to cost effectiveness, because Adam, you mentioned the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. The recent regulation, or the recent, let's say, amendment to the statutes at NICE suggests that severity would weigh 1.2 to 1.7 times the existing threshold, the efficiency threshold, which is between 20 and 30,000. So in other words, for orphan or severe diseases, that we could go up to 50,000. For ultra-orphan conditions, we could go up to several 100,000, depending on the number of qualities that we obtain. So there are different approaches to it, some of them relating to efficiency. A lot of it relates to affordability, going back to budgetary criteria, and some of it says, don't bother. At the end of the day, the budget impact of a new drug in a particular indication is going to be so low. Let's not go into the pains of assessing that drug for efficiency and affordability purposes if that cost to our system is not more than 20 million or 30.
Well, thank you. I think we're already unbelievably through our allotted time here with the foundation, so we will have to wrap things up there. But I'd just like to add that it's been a great pleasure, gentlemen, to see you again, to connect in this way, but also to have that fascinating expert analysis of the challenges and the progression. But in particular, I think the historical perspective that gives an understanding of the progress that has been made. Now, I'm sure when we revisit this topic, which I hope we will soon, looking at as you mentioned, the genetic developments in the gene and genetic screening world that are transforming a lot of health technology assessments and potential treatments and even eradication of particular genetic diseases, and the combination of that field with the application of orphan drugs, which are now more available, or perhaps more in development, or applied in different ways, or come to the market and come to the, as I say, the end user, the patient, to alleviate the suffering in many cases, is much more advanced and much more sophisticated than it used to be. So a fascinating discussion. I'm enormously grateful to both of you, and of course to the Foundation for its unwavering support and friendship and companionship over the last decade or so. I think I'm remembering, Ali, you came to Madrid at one point some time ago for one of our master classes in social science, at which we put many hundred participants through a program physically in the classroom in Madrid, and several thousands and tens of thousands even on the online programs that we do together. So we are enormously grateful to the Foundation for its great support and collaboration with the London School of Economics. My name is Adam Osterfield. It's been a real pleasure to chair the session today, and we hope to see you all at the next seminar between the Fundación Raras and the London School of Economics.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.